So, the head of the department is coming, but is blocked in the traffic of Rome, of course. It's normal. We decide to start with our forum. Of course, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Rome with this interesting project inaugurated by Roberto Cipriani. I would like to ask Roberto to introduce the topic of the conference, if you want.
Okay, let me say first of all that it is a very great pleasure to have all of you here. In some cases, after 10, 20 years and more. Because I have to say that our international conferences, our organization, do not favor this kind of meeting. The meeting of comparisons, the meeting of real discussion. In 1969, here in Rome, the Vatican Secretariat for Non-Believers, Giovanni Agnelli Foundation and the University of California organized an international symposium on the culture of unbelief, attended by the most renowned scholars of the religious phenomenon at an interdisciplinary level. Let me quote some names. Cox, Danielou, Luckman, Bella, Glock, Marty, Wilson, Parsons, and a few others. In 1975, there was in Baden, near Vienna, a second international symposium on belief, organized by Cardinal Franz Koenig, who was the president of the Secretariat for Unbelievers. The meeting was attended by Alberoni, Glock, Acquaviva, Burgalassi, Vergote, Marley, Pannenberg, Mertin, Novak, Benton Johnson, Marty, Bella, Paniker, Gertz, Luckman, and so on. In 1993, an international conference was promoted by Sapienza University in Rome on Religion sans frontières, ? Zolla, Raphael, Zilberberg, Hervieux Léger, Voyer, Filatov, Kokosalakis, Varga, Vrzan, Willem, Ibrahim, Lambert, Chebeng, Chekyong, Ummen, Bai, Sakurai, Zwingado, Ayashi, Sharma. Sharma is present in this forum too. Barker, Beckford, and some other international scholars discussed on the future of religion. And 2,500 copies of the book, Religion sans frontières, were distributed free of charge around the world. In 2019, 50 years after the first symposium, the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network, the University of Kent, the Queen's University of Belfast, the St. Mary University of Twickenham in London, the Understanding Unbelief Program, the Pontifical Council for Culture and the Pontifical Gregorian University jointly organized a public event in Rome on culture of unbelief to reflect on the legacy of the 1969 meeting, bringing together leading academics and leaders of religious organizations and considering the current state of the knowledge about unbelief around the world. Lois Lee from University of Kent, a lecturer in this forum, was there. Today, more than 50 years later, fundamental events have changed the history of mankind. Therefore, the time has come to take stock of the situation in a rigorous, open, non-prejudicial, scientific, reliable way, also with a view to widespread knowledge, dissemination of results, and possible operational consequences in the religious, but also social, political, ethical, and economic spheres. In the last 5 decades, the sociology of religion has made important progress both on the theoretical and methodological levels. The empirical activity of field research has been particularly developed. For some contests, there are now series of results, but what is lacking is international comparison due to problems caused by language barriers, of course, and the dominance of scientific and academic leadership groups that do not give much space to other contributions of local nature and sociological schools still in the process of development. The recent pandemic also exacerbated the differences because there has been a lack of opportunities for meetings and exchanges. This is another reason why this forum is an opportunity to recover and relaunch the supranatural debate in the field of social science applied to the religious phenomenon, thanks to the participation of the most accredited and reliable scholars. Particularly worth of attention is the new reality of knowledge about religions operating in the Asian world, which is not usually taken into account in the current debate. This is why our forum represents an almost unique opportunity to revitalize the international debate on religions. The forum will gather and discuss the results of recently concluded or still ongoing sociological research applied to the religious phenomenon and its trends, which seem to have overcome the impact of the secularization processes underway for some time in various countries. In particular, the proposal fits perfectly among the strategic issues regarding dynamics of religious change, religiosity and spirituality in terms of theoretical oriented and exemplarily conducted research, so much to constitute best practices. This can help to improve mutual understanding and overcome the differences between various religious affiliations. World religions today are no longer the same as in the more or less recent past. They seem to have changed internally, but they also seem to be participating in the processes taking place at world level, both quantitatively, attendance at rituals, participation in activities, contribution to institutional expenses, and qualitatively, intensity of belief, commitment to militancy, adherence to fundamental principles. There have been significant modifications which cannot be adequately understood with the traditional tools of scientific knowledge, but which require new approaches, including qualitative ones, for a more in-depth analysis, which is all the more reliable when it is based on a sufficiently articulated methodology, quantitative and qualitative at the same time, but also innovative in terms of triangulation between several methods. The aim of the forum is to establish the state of the art in the field of religions today, and to prepare a final document which may represent a common basis for scholars of social sciences applied to the religious phenomenon. There are 3 elements that form the backbone of our meeting, also in terms of results. First of all, the forum itself enables face-to-face contacts between representatives of the cultural world who have probably never met before or who have not seen each other for a long time. It is well known that personal and direct acquaintance produces much more substantial fruits than simply reading a text. Not only that, conviviality also helps the progress of science, since it has been authoritatively demonstrated with data in hand that, for example, dialogue in a cafeteria sometimes produces far more important results than those achieved in a laboratory. Not to mention the productivity of a wide-ranging and in-depth discussion. Then there is the added value of the planned final document to come out of the forum. This will be an absolute novelty and will establish a reference platform on the criteria of scientific activity applied to the religious phenomenon, also to avoid ideological and confessional interference. It seems that I have finished. Sorry. Okay, thank you so much. I have cut a little bit in order to permit a larger discussion on the next paper. Enzo.
Thank you, Roberto. I would like to remind that thank to Roberto for the great effort to organize this meeting. I tried to help him, but he was the how to say, the protagonist of this challenge, because to organize this meeting implied an effort to find the financial support, to contact people, to mobilize people, to convince them to participate in this interesting event. Thank you, Roberto. So now we could move to the first paper by Patrice Brodeur. Patrice Brodeur is an associate professor at the Institute of the Religious Studies at the University of Montreal, senior advisor at the International Dialogue Center in Vienna, and PhD in comparative religion, Islam, and Judaism. He spent 2 years at the Harvard University and then at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So is, I think, the best scholar who practiced this comparative attitude towards the studying of religions. I would only to quote the recent publication by Brodeur, Islam politique à l'ère du post-printemps arabe, 2017, and Religion as Conversation Starter in 2011. Thank you, Patrice. We could change the place.
Okay. Buongiorno. Good morning. Bonjour. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom aleichem. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this morning. I would like to begin by a triple set of gratitudes. Of course, to Professor Cipriani, who's our leadership person behind this effort of bringing us together in, if I may say so, the old traditional way of meeting face to face, with a little touch of contemporary sort of Zooming with a few also online, which is nice to know. And hopefully we'll be able to interact in this hybrid fashion. I'd like to thank also all of the organizers, because no man is an island, and therefore there are lots of other people that are part of the organizing of this, including the members of the steering committee of the International Center for the Sociology of Religion based here in Rome. So thank you to all of you. Grazie mille. And finally, I'd like to thank sort of the different sources of funding for this event, of course, and I'd like to mention them. You've seen the logos, but in addition to the International Center for the Sociology of Religion, there's the Instituto de Sociologia at the Università do Porto in Portugal, and the Fundación para a Ciencia e a Tecnologia from the Ministry of Science, Technology and Higher Education, also in Portugal. And finally, here in the north part of Italy, in Trento, the Fondazione Bruno Kessler, especially it's one of its 11 centers, the Center for Religious Studies. So that is a wonderful opportunity that this funding provides us, and we are very deeply thankful for that funding and opportunity. So many thanks to all those who are behind this organizing event. I will have the text. Some of you may have access already to the text. It's still in construction, and I will be presenting most of it in the 45 minutes that I'm provided with. And I will also, especially towards the end, break and show a few diagrams in order to hopefully divert also sort of the pedagogical dynamics of my presentation. We are, after all, in an institute of pedagogy and formation here, and so hopefully I'll be aware of that. So let me begin by saying that we live in a complex time of human history, which makes it at once intellectually exciting, fearful and hopeful emotionally, as well as challenging spiritually. And of course, those three adjectives probably being interchangeable depending on each one's perspective. One of those intellectual excitements for me is the exponential growth in scientific knowledge, which has the effect of increasing the entropy that emerges, primarily in our left brain, from a growing awareness of the diversity of conceptual frameworks based on various truth claims and theories. This exponential growth in scientific and philosophical truth claims is unfolding at the same time as there is also a similar, yet different, exponential growth in theological, spiritual, cosmovisional truth claims, both within the more well-known religious traditions, across them, as well as in new forms categorized as new religious movements. There is also the impact of various religious cultures on the public sphere in politically secular countries, and directly or indirectly on a variety of new generations of persons whose spiritual searches fall beyond the phenomena of traditional religions, so-called the nuns, the no religious identity people. I don't like the negative approach to that identity, but we hardly have a better way of calling it. Therefore, the truth claims on the second group in particular lie at the heart of the academic study of religions and spiritualities. And I won't add all the time and spiritualities, but when I say the academic study of religion, I want to include also in spiritualities. Yet the study of this second kind of truth claims, those truth claims that come from those religious and spiritual worldviews, relies on the first set of scientific and philosophical truth claims very often. And since we know that the academic study of religions also affects some changes in the phenomena of religions, a greater awareness of how the two sets of truth claims interrelate is also crucial to take into account in the scientific process unfolding in the academic study of religions in particular. Whether the two concomitant exponential growth in truth claims are the simple results of a third exponential growth in human demographics, we are, after all, 8 billion human beings on Earth today, or is the result, specifically for the first set of scientific and philosophical truth claims, the result of a postmodern process of decompartmentalization of earlier modern scientific disciplines, at least ideationally, if rarely institutionally, remains debatable. But what it points to, and that is my main hypothesis today, is that both kinds of trends in truth claims, as well as when they directly interrelate with each other, as in the tension or the conflict between religiously anchored versus scientifically secularly anchored discourses, so ubiquitous to the academic study of religions, especially as it developed in Europe initially, that this kind of dynamic is ubiquitous, coming together are slowly going through a new paradigm shift, away from competing truth-seeking discourses, whether in the name of science or religion, towards greater complexity in both processes of continuing conceptualization and self-critical intersubjectivity on all three fronts. The first two truth claims and also their interrelationship. To this end, there seems to be less debate and more dialogue today. This change is reflected in at least 4 sociologically measurable areas. First, there's a growing number of universities worldwide that give a growing importance to interdisciplinarity, and more recently, even transdisciplinarity. Second, there is a growing trend towards inter-university collaborations and networks of scholars across the theology, science of religions continuum that cross the traditional divide between religiously based and secular state institutions of higher learning, even though there are pockets of resistance that remain in both kinds, given their often very different ways of conceiving, if at all, the scientific project. In a nutshell, the old faith versus reason debate is in the process of changing. Third, the increased pressures towards questions of social relevancy and impact, coming especially from many national governmental sources key to research funding, especially for the humanities and social sciences, has given new impetus to applied religious studies. And fourth, one of the many areas in the applied academic study of religion is in the realm of interreligious interfaith dialogue, whether bilateral, trilateral, or multilateral. In this arena alone, there is a wide range of approaches, from high-end academic scriptural reasoning, for example, initiated at Cambridge University, and theological dialogues, such as, for example, the Elijah Institute based in Jerusalem, and doing primarily sort of bringing together academics that are religiously based in 5 major religious traditions. From that kind of high-end academic approach to dialogue to grassroots student-led initiatives in both high school and university levels, and of course the famous example in the United States is what used to be called the Interfaith Youth Corps, recently changed to Interfaith America. For a global list of various initiatives of this youth kinds, it's important to look at the CAICI Dialogue Knowledge Hubs, Connect to Dialogue section that provides numerous promising practices. So the central double question I am seeking to address today, from a quadruple theoretical approach of myself, being rooted in history and the sociology of religions, combined with worldview, conflict, and peace studies, as well as from my scholar practitioner perspective, is the following. How can we best conceive this new paradigm shift away from debate towards dialogue? How can we conceive this paradigm shift simplified? And even more importantly, who stands to benefit from this paradigm shift intellectually, economically, socially, and yes, spiritually? To be very honest, this double question awakens in me a feeling of emotional anxiety, confronted by the deep awareness of my own subjectivities, privileges, limitations, and inadequacies, rooted in a unique personal tragedy that is finite, contextual, and yes, intertwined with my multiple identity factors that are all born out of a complex set of interpersonal, intergroup, and intersystemic dynamics of power. Where I have been found to be a direct and indirect participant, consciously or unconsciously, on many points along the continuum from victim to victimizer, albeit fortunately, never at the extremes of both ends. In particular, I have been questioning for over 3 decades, with both tremendum et fascinans, to borrow Otto's linguistic heritage, the many instances of double or more identity positionings that often lead to intellectual contradictions and value incoherencies in self-perceptions, as well as in how we treat many others, especially from other identities, and how they perceive us in return. All of these identity factors and power dynamics inevitably influence what I think, what we think, and how I feel and how we feel, directly impacting my meager intellectual productivity and my widespread pedagogical outputs, geographically speaking, with a further layer of complexity in all the guilt, actually, that comes along with the large carbon footprint I have left behind with all those travels. Moreover, at all times, and like any human being, my unique set of identity and power dynamics is infused with unavoidable and omnipresent politics. In French, we distinguish between le politique and la politique. We don't have that in English. In this case, it's le politique, that reflect the effects of history on our contemporary contingencies of localized human inequalities and exploitation of our fragile environmental ecosystem. As we have entered the Anthropocene period in the history of planet Earth, humanity thus confronts at the root of the multiple crises that have become so apparent during the COVID-19 pandemic worldwide. It confronts a common major spiritual challenge in the face of our exponentially deteriorating ecosystem. A variety of envisioned future scenarios have emerged to address this extraordinary moment in our common human history. They include, among others, a growing belief, especially among the younger generations, that the future of humanity on Earth is facing an impending precipice. That is, of course, the case from the perspective of mostly the privileged who have benefited so far from the peace dividends over more than half a century of relative political multilateral peace, depending on the regions. So, an additional questions we may raise, or we must raise, is how does such a level of anxiety, of fear, affect worldviews for both religious and non-religious people alike today? In addition to my previous central double question, I want to add an important corollary question that elicits a prescriptive purpose behind the pursuit of contemporary scientific knowledge, especially in our own field. How can our diverse meaning-making human processes bring locally urgent changes politically, economically, psychologically, socially, and spiritually in order to reduce growing anxieties and fears about our precarious futures? The fear of the other, both within and beyond our own identity groups, for quantitative and qualitative analyses of a broad variety of such examples, you can look at the website of ODIHR, the Office of Human Rights, linked to OSCE, that published on the 16th of November 22nd, its latest survey of the levels of intolerance for 2021. It's called the 2021 hate crime data. And so the intolerance of diverse readings of human history to various hermeneutical and epistemological perspectives result in increasing numbers of physical and psychological, not to mention structural violence, further fragilizing our human resiliency and capacity to avoid victimization dynamics, the drama triangle. By teaching ourselves how to respond to injustice through the empowerment triangle, for example, and all of the spiritual traditions that have something to say to how to build that resiliency. When we study the phenomena, for example, of genocide, feminicide, ecocide, religiocide, etc., we discover transversal causes that are most often linked to a variety of factors, of course, such as the scapegoat dynamics, which is one possible element in a much more complex set of dynamics. Both function within the intertwined identity and power dynamics, which, when they work properly, reflect healthy interdependencies that create sustainable futures for all human communities living within a given society, rather than the opposite, the unhealthy codependencies that only reinforce the cycles of violence. These all contribute to reinforcing systems justification mechanisms that undergird so many of our current systems, whether ideological, religious, even at times ideological or philosophical. It thus becomes imperative to continue to deconstruct not only the social and political histories of religion, spiritualities, new religious movements, etc., but also the multiple ways they have participated, for better and for worse, in the history of various kinds of polities over centuries and millennia up to the present. It is in particular urgent to study also how they have contributed to the more recent emergence of the dominant post-colonial and at times neo-colonial nation-state models on a spectrum from post-humanist citizenship democracies to authoritarian and or theocratic polities, whether ethno or religio-based predominantly, within international and transnational relations, often in competition over human and especially material resources, causing massive exploitations and multi-generational traumas. Slavery and the dynamics of racism, for example. Heteropatriarchy and the dynamics of queer oppressions. Secular religious dynamics that reinforce anti-religious stereotypes, prejudices, and discriminations. Ethno-nationalist, exclusivist ideologies and their xenophobic results, etc., etc. Intersectionality as a critical inquiry and praxis is an important theory that helps understand better the intertwined nature of multiple identity and power dynamics, often resulting in compound forms of discrimination and oppression. When combined with decolonial theory, the two approaches contribute directly to explaining how much of the intellectual production within often systemically racist universities is therefore limited and in need of expanding the identity diversity that makes up its personnel and student bodies with greater participatory and democratic processes in educational practices. This historical and contemporary deconstruction process used in much of our studies, but also turned onto our own professional environments, can improve our collective understanding of not only how religious person, adherents, institutions, organizations, faith-based organizations have shaped human history up to the present, for better or worse, as I said, but also how we scholars affect the very objects and subjects we study. This academic endeavor also throws light on current power dynamics between a variety of individual and collective players, whether institutionally, etc. Institutionally, NGOs, microgroups, and emergent communities, modern civil society, religious and multi-religious organizations, as well as on how many of these players, individually and collectively, are located personally and institutionally in the religious landscapes we study. Moreover, this complex set of interrelationships with their own unique power dynamics all function within the local dynamics of mostly shaped by nation states today. It is therefore important to visually understand how various concentric circles affect each other. And here I will take a second and show sort of a few of the slides that I'm thinking about when I talk about sort of dynamics. Is that when we talk about these different levels of political decision making, they happen within structures at different geographical levels. There are 6 of them here. And of course, the relationship between the governmental kinds or intergovernmental kinds of institutions, religious and civil NGOs, or more precisely defined here, creates 7 different spaces in which sort of different kinds of interactions are possible. And the question is, how do they affect each other? And so this, is already in and of itself a very rich kind of way of looking at diversity of spaces and where the interactions are taking place between religious individuals or non-religious individuals and the power dynamics that those spaces create between them. Then, of course, are the levels of government responsible for religious policy on various thematic issues. If we just take the case of Europe, for example, you can see that which level of governmental structures is given power to relate to the religious communities is interesting. It varies from country to country, from very local municipalities level to sub-regional to eventually, it's not very clear. I don't know if there's a way to turn these lights off. And if I could zoom, I can try to do that indeed. Thank you. At least for the broad categories. Yes, thank you so much. Good suggestion. And so when you look at these different levels, already that's a kind of example of how the structures of different levels of political decision-making influences, of course, differently how religious communities function within those frameworks. At least those religious communities who seek to have official recognition within those levels of government. Of course, there are always those either smaller, often religious groups or newer religious communities or individuals who don't necessarily want to have that kind of relationship with official structures of political decision-making. So these are 3 different annexes in my paper. And the one that I'm interested in showing to you in particular, and I'll come back to those 3 that I've just passed, but it's this one here, which is, there we go, which is those different concentric circles within which sort of we live our lives. And so the individual is always within a set of interpersonal dynamics. And those interpersonal dynamics are not happening in a vacuum. They always happen, whether we like it or not, in different degrees of interorganizational dynamics. We are meeting today, yes, here, but in a hall which is linked to a university and so on and so forth, within a city and so on and so forth. And then, of course, each of these organizations and levels of structures have their own unique worldviews, explicit or implicit. And therefore, that also has influences. And all of that works also within sort of what I call interspecies dynamic, how human beings interact with other forms of life on planet Earth. And finally, there is what I call, although this last concentric circle may be debatable, especially from an atheistic perspective, on intertranscendencies. And so that is to be debated. But these are the kinds of complexities I'm talking about in this paper. And one in particular sort of dynamic that I will get to in a moment, but I'll leave it up there, is these distant vectors of identity construction and GPD, which is global power dynamics. And so there are multiple vectors here from the very simple sort of economic, the left-right spectrum in economic philosophies, you know, from more collectivized versus more privatized. That's an obvious one, and so on and so forth. But there are many other kinds of dynamics of identity construction and power dynamics that I'm trying to put in a visual format, even though, of course, we're dealing here with multiple dimensions, and that's what complicates sort of our abilities to understand. Thus, entitling this paper sort of towards mapping a kaleidoscopic global religious studies or global academic study of religion. So that's in a nutshell for the moment, and you'll see how I get back to these in a moment. How am I doing on time? Just 1 second. My computer is not so patient, so I have to reopen it. There we go. So, given this complexity of concentric circles and these multidimensional vectors, I ask myself sort of therefore, what is our responsibility as scholars, scientists, in this unfolding human and environmental trajectory of potential collective self-destruction? And how can we ask such big questions without following into the dangers of essentialist or essentializing grand narratives? It is worth quoting Annemiek Richter's suggestion, quote, that solidarity and ethics require us to maintain these meta-narratives, at least in an improved version, while keeping openness to difference and otherness. As we try to address these broad existential questions, I would like to add greater depth to Richter's generic suggestions by suggesting prescriptively in turn that from our commonly shared identity as scholars, scientists in the academic study of religions here, very broadly speaking, we must not only practice more dialogue among us in all our current diversity of approaches, schools of thought, theories, and methodologies that have emerged over more than a century and a half, but we must also intentionally seek to practice greater inclusion and equity in the sheer diversity of identities that constitute those who have the privilege to join the ranks of our professional community, the professors, the teachers, the researchers, the assistants of various kinds, and so on and so forth. I think that we only have to look at the composition of this room, for example, and understand that we do not reflect the diversity of the world, nor as a subset, those within that world who are more or less 80% of the world's populations, who are part of, in some shape or form, of religious communities or are participating in some form of religious identity. So therefore, there is an opportunity to grow and expand in seeking to be more inclusive and diverse in the composition of who is within our ranks, as well as who do we serve and who do we integrate in the process. Indeed, sociologically, despite what Alice, in his 2010 book on religious studies, A Global View, clearly demonstrated in his introductory chapters, when he listed the 42 national and regional associations within the International Association for the History of Religion, by the way, of course, the oldest professional organizations of scholars of religion, broadly speaking, established in 1900, there is what emerges from that picture is that there is an emerging global dynamic in our field. It would therefore be useful to expand such a study today and find a mechanism to keep it an ongoing and up-to-date project with the likes of a website for sociology, seeing and studying how this growth is unfolding, where are its challenges, and what results and global impact it might be having over time locally. Moreover, it is also clear that much of manuscript production in our field remains primarily in European languages, especially when it comes to theory and practice, and mostly in English. So the task of expanding and diversity, of expanding and diversifying our professional collective aims and objectives remains widely open to this day. For example, in what languages do we do our collective work? Where do we hold our conferences? In association with whom also? And with which institutions and organizations when we seek to address whose research and pedagogical agendas to develop? The list of questions, of course, can go on and on. How is it possible, when thinking over a broader range of time, concomitant to the rise of modern science, do we actually formulate sort of the ways in which we think of this paradigm shift, or what I call a new paradigm shift, away from debate, more towards dialogue? Today, we have to recognize that, that the rhythm of change is exponential, with a concomitant and ever-increasing diversity of human challenges growing in magnitude. One of the many is the impact on our human capacity to imagine collective security, reducing it predominantly to weaponization processes within nation-state ideological control, at times shared through interstate alliances, NATO, etc. In this but too real scenario, the ultimate human security has come to be understood in terms of chemical, nuclear, and more recently biological warfare processes. But as the threat of nuclear bombs looms anew over different parts of the world, obviously Eastern Europe, Korean Peninsula, Western Asia, etc., not to mention all Western Asia, i.e. Middle East, not to mention all nation-state in possession of nuclear weapons and technology, some of which are regularly circumnavigating the Earth deep beneath the sea's surface. What have we learned, especially from the humanities and social sciences, about our propensities and idiosyncrasies as human beings? How, to take but one among many possible examples, do communicative ethics and communicative rationality, for example, help address such nuclear urgency? And within the vast sea of scientific knowledge, what have been the contributions of the scientific or academic study of religions per se? How have internal debates over definitions of key terms such as religion or belief, among many others, and over different theories and methods contributed to our better understanding of human ways of knowing, of acting, of being, and of becoming? I suggest, therefore, that how we organize our field of academic study and how we present this to our students in particular, but also to a broader a variety of stakeholders seeking better information and understanding about religions today, that all of this requires us to rethink our common agenda as scholars through better dialogical practices with clearer purposes and more potentially impactful aims and objectives. And this process cannot take place today without a broader, more inclusive and equitable participatory dialogue amongst both the adherents of the communities we study and those who seek to become professional student scholars about them from whatever perspective it might be. And thus the need, therefore, as one example of a broader project of mapping, what I call sort of a kaleidoscopic mapping for global religious studies. Is it possible to even think of this map? And obviously, by mapping in this case, we no longer need only a two-dimensional map, nor even three-dimensional, given sort of the kinds of dynamics of multiple continuums that or spectrums that are shown here, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Many more could be added. My purpose, therefore, in this presentation is to share briefly some of my explorations on how to go about such an ambitious endeavor for our time to develop such a kaleidoscopic mapping for global religious studies.
Speaking English today, every day. No, te lo sto dicendo io, dico benvenuta nel mio mondo di sociologi che parlano in inglese dalla mattina alla sera.
So, and that's the welcome interruptions of Zoom dynamics. So from the outset, of course, I recognize two important limitations to trying to do this kind of broader mapping. The first, of course, is that I carry my own subjectivities, and I can go on that. But second, no one person is capable of doing such a broad mapping exercise alone, nor is such a mapping exercise ever static and exhaustive. There are too many variables and factors that may or not be included, depending first and foremost on how we define the central concept of religion, around which the edifice of the academic study of religion has been constructed of more or less a century and a half. Of course, even the origins of our field is a debate. And I can sort of, I have sections in my paper on that, but I'm going to skip them for the moment. So one of my primary purpose for attempting this endeavor of mapping sort of more broadly and inclusively this complex sort of phenomena of religion, or the complex dynamics around the phenomena of religion, is simple. It stems from a growing feeling of inadequacy when teaching a variety of courses in the academic study of religion. Over 3 decades, I have taught 6 kinds of courses. Those focus on one religious tradition, those focusing on a theme, either using a comparative religion approach or using a combination of empirical and or applied approaches. And of course, teaching the cardinal courses on theories and methods in the study of religion, as well as the master's and doctoral seminars guiding generations of students on their scientific paths. I wish I could start each course pinpointing through something visual and interactive, such as this kind of map. I wish I could point to where this course is situated. How does it fit a broader framework so that the students can more quickly understand sort of that specific focus that we have time to cover within one course. And of course, this kind of ability is equally necessary, especially for the master's and PhD students, as they try to figure out sort of how does the particular focus of their thesis and doctoral work is going to be fitting within a broader framework. So because teacher, trainer, scholars have the responsibility to provide that kind of broader picture to their students, to our students, such a multidimensional map could help them better guide, can help us better guide each student in their respective learning process, especially when it comes time to make necessary theoretical and methodological choices, and developing also a habit of how best to go about doing so. After all, we all know that better knowledge of theory and method is not only ensuring sort of better quality of research, but also the possibility of communicating across our disciplines, especially in the humanities and social sciences. I always like to say that theory and method is like the lingua franca that we can use interdisciplinarily speaking. One task I asked in a nutshell, I'm skipping here. In a nutshell, one of my purposes today is thus to help my students see the forest and the trees, knowing, of course, it will never be possible to describing all trees. But what does remain hopefully possible is the aim of identifying better the kinds of trees that exist and articulating them into meaningful and interrelatable categories for our contemporary need to understand the ecosystem of both religions and scholars thereof through developing a multidimensional map. So I think, how much time do I have? Because, oops, Enzo, sorry, how much? Yeah. 5, okay, then I'll skip sort of a number of different parts. Hopefully you have access to the paper. And maybe for a matter of time, I think it's more useful for me if I focus. Well, first I'm going to go to the slides because that's always a pause to listening to me. I told you I would come back to these 2 other vectors of identity dynamics, and that's also important. Just 1 second. There we go. No. Here you have important sort of vectors like majority and minority, powerful, powerless, and so on and so forth. But all of these, of course, spectrum, each one of them is contingent on the perceptions within which one functions. And this is part of where the complexity arises. For example, I remember very clearly one day when I was teaching French as a second language in an Anglophone school in Montreal, whereby, you know, the diversity of my students were coming out of the diversity of relatively new immigrant populations. And I was representing for them the dominant French-Canadian majority within the boundaries of the Quebec province. But for me, they were representing or part of that diversity of Anglophone cultural dynamics taking place within Canada. Of course, we ended up in a tense argument within that classroom simply because we were projecting different boundaries of references to our own identities, either making it feel minority to ourselves and projecting the majorityness on the other, and therefore having a dialogue of the deaf. And so that dynamic is part of what I've been trying to sort of deconstruct over the decades and try to better understand, because I think it explains a lot of the misunderstandings and misperceptions in our intercultural and interreligious communication today. So these are different vectors here. And then, in order not to crowd that too much, then there's another way of looking at it here. And it's a little different in this case because the horizontal line is a little different than the previous spectrum. It's more the level of interdependency and codependency, the interdependency being sought in the middle versus being at one end or the other. And that's part of the challenge, I think, in understanding sort of the dynamics of interrelatedness. There's the formal versus informal, formal being linked to structures of decision-making, whether within religious or other forms of organizational bodies, being more representational versus sort of informal being more what centralized vector, which I call sort of the decision-making vector. Who decides at the end for a collective group of people? So part of mapping that diversity of identity dynamics and power dynamics is to try to figure out how to therefore visually make sense of how all of this interrelates. And I'm still out there sort of seeking to better understand sort of how to go about doing this. And that being sort of one sort of examples of an attempt in that direction, which is anyway limited despite its relative complexity. So, now let me look towards the future in the last few minutes I have. Imagining the future of the academic study of religion can also be attempted in various ways. One individual effort is that of Marco Ventura, who seriously embarked on an envisioning process in his recent book, Nelle mani di Dio, coining the concept of a super religion. His fascinating interdisciplinary exercise into the future, using his vast knowledge of jurisprudence, history, and sociology, explores one possible emergent future in our field. But there are also examples of collective efforts to foresee the future in one specific area of knowledge about religious phenomena. As we have learned from analyzing human projections into the past, i.e. myth-making, invention of traditions, hagiographical processes, it will become useful to analyze how human projections functions into the future. We already know that the time vector is made up of a linear continuum from past to future, even though each person is always assessing, interpreting, living the notion of past, present, and future within his or her own contextual present moment. Nevertheless, it is possible to compare over time the changing constructions of human discourses about past, present, and future. What is new is the possibility to study the complex phenomena of the global religious landscape over different punctual points in time, and from those sets of information, project into the future. For example, as a first step, the Pew Research Center in the United States has started to develop global monitoring tools to evaluate the nature of the religious composition of the world's population in precisely given years. As a second step, they have more recently studied this landscape as it changes over time by comparing the information gathered from one given year to another. From an analysis of these changing during its first studied 5-year period, 2010 to 2015, it has then begun to project into the future as far as 2035. The results are fascinating, although they remain, in my opinion, equally precarious forecasts and possibly even a source of manipulation by some person or identity groups. Nevertheless, it would then be incumbent upon scholars to study how similar or different the patterns of past projections are to those of future projections, and how dangerous deductions about myth-making for the past and eschatological predictions for the future might be for more coherent historiography and reconstructions of world history on the one hand, as well as futurology and imagination for future scenario thinking so necessary to prepare for a broad variety of potential futures, and not only for creative emergent ones, as important as they may be to avoid the worst. So let's take, I will skip another things, and therefore I'm going to move on now to my conclusion because of time. In a nutshell, It is both an exciting and deeply challenging time to be a student or scholar of religions today. The academic study of religion, spiritualities, or religious studies, in particular, of course, the sociology of religion, is a domain or field of scientific inquiry that is preeminently interdisciplinary in a university that is pluridisciplinary, in a globalized world that requires often collective transdisciplinary approaches today. While it is obvious that all of us here present contribute both theoretically and methodologically to our shared academic field, that's what I assume, we are also nourished by exceptionally rich new human and material resources that create exponentially new creative cross-fertilization processes. Given that these are all happening amidst challenging human circumstances, epitomized especially by the latest scientific data on our unfolding global climate crisis and threats to multilateral political stability, there is no time to resist contributing further towards what I claim to be yet another new paradigm shift from competition over truth claims on what constitute the best or the right scientific theories and methodologies to more dialogue and collaboration within ever more complex projects that require student scholars to learn how to become more interdependent and complementary in our respective and often unique points of views on always limited portions within the vast body of religious phenomena, past and present. Part of this collaboration also needs to include various individual and institutional religious stakeholders in the results of our research projects. In that sense, that's how we might be able to eventually get to having a more inclusive kaleidoscopic mapping for local religious studies or the academic study of religion. Indeed, we need to collaborate more closely together on a scale broader than ever achieved before in order to develop a more inclusive collective research roadmap with more interdependent, interdisciplinary research teams so as to contribute better and more solid ongoing scientific results to the broader aim of improving the human condition as become more aware and responsible for our role in making our human future more sustainable within our fragile planetary environment. The stakes are higher than ever before. Our time is short. Let's recommit to play our individual and collective roles as scholars of religions and spiritualities in improving the relevancy of what we do best professionally so that we can contribute realistically towards a just and sustainable well-being for humanity through leveraging its diverse and at times opposing forces and visions. In this respect, I think that the example of the joint statement that some of you have been working on for this particular conference is a wonderful step in this direction. Indeed, and this is my last paragraph, the complexity of human dynamics is always broader and deeper than we can individually or even collectively imagine. Yet, under the current extraordinary pressures of our multiple urgencies, our meaning-making, cosmo-envisioning, healing-seeking, and interrelaying human nature, combined with a new aspiration for compassionate engagement and compassionate reasoning, to use the recent publication of Mark Gopin, all of this can help all of us here present in person and online to coalesce better into a force for emergent creativity within the scientific community, and when appropriate, in collaborations, both with cross-sectoral endeavors within governments, IGOs, INGOs, and FBOs, among others, as well as with institutions and organizations of transnational and local religious and spiritual communities worldwide. Therefore, the tasks ahead are immense, and our unique roles in them, individually and collectively, are immensely urgent as well. Grazie mille. Thank you very much. Miglic.
Thank you, Patrice. So, if you have any questions, remarks, and of course comments on this paper, we have 15 minutes, 20 minutes just before the break. Roberta Pretorio, cosa c'è? Devono venire qua? Roberto, devono venire qua?
Va bene così, grazie. Good morning, and thanks a lot for this wonderful and inspiring paper. So I'm taking the chance to start with maybe a new generation of sociologists in this forum. So I have 3 comments. I don't know if we want to discuss them right now or to put them on the table for the final forum documents. So the first comment deals with the table concerning the religious management according to different different levels and in the perspective of the multi-governance level of religions. So to what extent international event could intervene in changing the way in which religions could be managed and could control or could admitted at different levels, starting by the local one to the national or supranational levels. I have in my mind, for instance, the role played by the European Union in suggesting only on this topic something to the country members, or on the other hand, to what extent international events like terroristic attacks could intervene nationally and locally in change the different way of funding or giving public space and inviting in the public arena different religious groups. So this is the first comment. The second comment deals with all of us in terms of our public role. We are scholars involved in religious studies, and we may have to play a specific role in the public arena in order to change the way in which religions could be understood, religions could be viewed, and in terms of which a religious group can be inserted at the political or at the social levels in the different contexts or countries. And the last comments focus on your slides dealing with identities and different issues that could intervene in managing identities at different levels, from economics to politics and so on and so forth. One of the lack identity I would suggest deals with the so-called stereotypes identity. So some religious identity traits are framed in a kind of never updated story. I'm going to speak about Muslims, and in Europe as well as in Canada, Muslims are still the same. They used not to be changed. They are portrayed as strong, active believer. The issue of atheism or secularization seems to be out of the picture. But the BOs are going to change, are going to be reframed, also in the Muslim context, also in the other kind of religions, and not only for those we can perceive as unknowns. Thanks again.
No, sure. This doesn't work. I have to go. Okay.
The video. Just in
yes,
front,
the video.
yes, just in front of you.
Yes. Grazie. Thank you very much for those three questions to set the table. On the first question, I could say that the table, which is in Annex 3, of course, represents sort of the European situation, but it raises so many interesting questions in and of itself. And so part of what I hope is that eventually the same kind of table could be globalized, but having a website where that kind of table is not only sort of expanded to include all countries around the world, but also constantly updated, because of course it keeps changing in countries sometimes depending on which elements we include in the table. So that's the kind of vision I'm hoping to have, for the future. And in that sense, I'm going to link that to the need to respond and be more engaged, collectively speaking, in the public arena, especially in terms of governmental policy decision making. Is that I have in mind the kind of funding that goes into Le CERN. Le CERN for quantum physics, theoretical physics, has been invaluable in the kinds of intellectual output in scientific discoveries and so on and so forth. But we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. Of course, it's a collective multi-governmental endeavor to fund this kind of research. It's a grand scale research project. We need, maybe not quite so grand scale, but definitely grand scale projects as well in our field. And it's certainly not going to be fundable through the national funding research agencies. And it requires sort of a higher level of governmental funding or a multilateral funding collaboration. This is the kind of conversations that I think that we could stand to benefit from, so that eventually the table that I'm showing on, in Annex 3 can not only be expanded globally, but also sustain over time. And so this is because everybody, all the stakeholders in all their diversity, both within religious communities and in a variety of different sort of, especially governmental sectors at different levels, are often in need of understanding what's this phenomenon, what's this religion thing, and how the complexity, it's difficult to understand for us, so let alone for the neophytes, that are trying to understand, or even those who are maybe very deeply engaged in their own faith communities, but know very little, if anything, about other religious communities. So those places, using the internet and the website technology that we have today, can be incredibly helpful in raising sort of public awareness and understanding, as well as eventually better policy in addressing stereotypes, which is the next sort of and the third element that you raised. And therefore, on that level, I thank you, because it is true that there is no spectrum or line, that addresses this variety from stereotype on the one hand. I don't even have a proper concept to put at the other end of that spectrum, but something like understanding the diversity within, but that's too long. I'd like to have one word, to have at the bookend of that continuum. But that's the kind of additional spectrum that indeed are needed to be added to enrich that kind of approach to what I call spectrum representations of identity and power dynamics affecting, because it's not only religion, but affecting the religious phenomena. Thank you.
Other comments?
Excuse me. I speak from the perspective of something that was popular when I was young and had hair. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer referred to traditions from which one comes as both an avenue opening up horizons and horizons narrowing the field of what one can perceive. I spent some years in Canada at a time just after the Quiet Revolution, when a whole generation was secularizing, throwing off everything that had to do with religion. And this was part of a psychological revolt against being a part of Canada. And then afterwards, rather than such a debate, Canada is still with us, and there is consultation. So I'm wondering whether your personal experience has opened up both an avenue and set horizons on the paradigm shift from debate to consultation.
Thank you for your question. Indeed, I think that I'm informed, of course, first and foremost by the context which is mine, right? Which is where I grew up, sort of where I function, where I teach at the moment. Although I've spent 15 years in the States, I spent 2 years in Jerusalem, I spent 1 year in Jordan, in different higher education environments, in order to, and hopefully that has helped me understand sort of and be able to look more critically in return, coming back home on my society, on my institutions, and so on and so forth. So that's the first general point. But indeed, I think that this, and I would add another spectrum on the basis of processes of horizon making, narrowing versus sort of broadening as the two ends of a spectrum, as a nice kind of addition here. And more specifically, I think that part of what allows for this sort of broadening versus the narrowing is linked to notions of how a person is able or not to feel included in a citizen process within a country, whatever the nature of that country might be. And so national ideologies are very powerful around the planet to this day. We only need to look at Olympics on the one hand to other forms of national sort of ideologies from left to extreme right. So the nation state has a particular responsibility, and it doesn't matter at this point whether it's more democratic or more authoritarian. There is a responsibility to ensure that the citizenship within their boundaries are becoming more and more sort of engaged through education primarily, but also through the various ways in which we want to intervene in the virtual spaces, especially social media, in order to engage the processes of encountering the other in ways that eventually broadens the horizon rather than makes it more narrow. But there are, and here, of course, things get a little complicated because I may be accused of being, having pink glasses when I say what I just said, because there are more and more, how do you say in English, ingérence, interventions? Yeah, I guess interference, thank you. Interference by a variety of through different AI, artificial intelligence mechanisms, into trying to shape the ways in which we think about reality. And we know, or at least it's beginning to emerge, that one can tilt the results of democratic elections as much as 20%, depending on the ways in which there can be interference in the social media places where we practice and interact with each other, if we actually use social media for our interactions. And especially for the younger generation, this is becoming by far the dominant way in which it happens. And so that's the importance of understanding better sort of those kinds of interferences that are really deeply problematic. And in this case, again, I'm referring to a recent report, literally, I think it's about 2 weeks ago, a report from the Pew Research in the States that looks at notions of agency. And it's in my paper, but I didn't have time to get to it. And the notion of agency is changing, and not necessarily for the better. And this is where I think by relying more on external mechanisms of online filling out forms and things like that and whatnot, sometimes we relegate our responsibility to others, often unknown people or groups of people, whose interests may not be in our own best personal and collective identity interests. And so how do we address those questions? We need to study them sociologically as far as it affects, in our case, religious communities and individuals and so on and so forth, but also how it affects sort of what I call sort of the discourses on the shaping of our human understanding of humanity and of our conditions today. And that is where my lenses as a person involved in conflict resolution, or conflict transformation, I prefer to call it, sort of becomes very important as well. So I use sometimes sort of approaches that are from that kind of humanities, as interdisciplinary humanities and social sciences approaches, to inform how I want to approach the responsibility we have as scholars of religions per se. Long answers to your question, hopefully useful.
Now we have coffee break. You go in this room behind your seats. 11 o'clock in Italian style, and we start. Okay. We have the pleasure to have the head of the Department of Education of University of Rome 3. I would like to introduce for the short greetings, please.
Hello, sorry if I'm late. Many duty, as you can imagine. So welcome to Roma 3 University, welcome to the Department of Education. It's really a pleasure to host this important forum. But first of all, I bring the greetings of the Rector, Professor Massimiliano Fiorucci. He is very, as you can imagine, busy, and he has an important duty, and he cannot be with us and with you today. So He's sorry for that. So really it's a pleasure to host this important forum on religion. It's a pleasure to host in the Department of Education in this very nice room. Why? Because in our department there are several researchers who are experts in the study of interculturality, intercultural education, and interreligious dialogue. So the topic of this forum is important topic also for the researchers in our department. So we teach, we research on these topics in our undergraduate program and in some master programs. Moreover, in the last years, with some colleagues from our department, some colleagues of the Department of Human Studies in our university, some colleagues present in this forum from other Italian universities, and some universities of the, what we call in Italian, OCI countries, that means Islamic University. We won a project that's called Pre-Med project, supported by the Ministry of University, which addressed the really the topic of the process of integration in Italy and the contrast to the radicalism. So, as you see, we are involved in the interculturality and interreligion dialogue. Moreover, as Roma Tre University, we participate in the what we call in Italian FIRD network, the International Forum for Democracy and Religion, which is in collaboration between universities, but also civil society, public institution, and cultural association. So this network has the aim to reflect on different aspects of linked to the coexistence in the modern society with a high ethnic religion pluralism, and to promote the interaction and the religion dialogue. So I really welcome you, and I wish you good work in this 3 days forum. And sorry if I will not be so much time with you, but I'm really busy today. And so again, welcome and good work. Thank you.